Hello, and welcome to the Rogue Theater and the Forest of Arden from As You Like It. We're so thrilled to have Dr. Peter Medine, Professor Emeritus of the University of Arizona English Literature Department, here to talk to us about As You Like It. Please enjoy.
Very well. I'm very glad to be here. It's a great privilege. Indeed, it's a great honor to do my small part for our premier theater in Tucson, and especially the great tradition that they have inaugurated and sustained of always concluding their season in April about the death date and the birth date, we think, of Shakespeare on April 22nd. This year's, you all know, their Shakespeare play is As You Like It. And of Shakespeare's plays, I can't say that this is my favorite play, but it is one of my favorite plays. And since all of his plays are my favorite play, this is especially distinctive. So what I want to do is to leap right into the play. The plot of As You Like It. The plot of As You Like It is great. Now, I mean by great, not only very good theater and so on, but also it's big. There are 3,000 lines in As You Like It. That's the longest of the romantic comedies, of which this is one. Shakespeare writes 8 or 9 romantic comedies. The parts are many. Speaking parts are 20, 21, 22, however, and there are even additional parts in the play. So we're dealing with a big play, and we're dealing with a play that is quite variegated. It's quite diverse, and this can be wonderfully effective, and it also can be, in a way, unless we're really familiar with the play, can be challenging. My belief is, after years of living with the play, indeed decades of living with the play, is that Shakespeare actually is aware of this fact, that it's a big play, that it can be elusive, that it can be challenging in some ways, and he has taken pains. He's taken pains to structure the play in a, well, for lack of a better adjective, in a very systematic way. And so, if you look at the illustration that I've put together, a schematization, what I've done is to enumerate and list some of the strands of the action. That's a word that I like to use, especially when we have diverse and multiple plots in a play. Strands of the action. And what we have here are 3 strands of action. As you can see on the right side of the scheme, we have a relationship. It's a romantic relationship, and this is a romantic relationship between 2 characters, Silvius and Phoebe. Now, Silvius and Phoebe are going to appear to us as unrealistic, not actualistic, not people that we encounter or even can identify with personally in any very direct way. That's intentional. There's Silvius and Phoebe, and they are idealized, they're idealistic, they are romanticized, they are literary rather than human, to perhaps overstate the point. That is to say, they're figures from pastoral literature, from pastoral poetry, pastoral romance. It's a tradition that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And Shakespeare has chosen these characters and contrived these characters to suggest just that. So they're idealized, they're idealistic, they're sophisticated in a kind of way. They're stock characters. I'll come back to that in a moment. On the left side of the illustration, of the scheme, is the characters of Touchstone and Audrey, 2 characters who are far removed from Silvius and Phoebe. These are characters that we have come to call, these are the sorts of characters that we've come to call 200 years ago or so, we've come to call low characters. And what we mean by that is relatively on the social, economic, political scale, they are lower. They are not refined. They're certainly not refined in the way Phoebe and Sylvius are refined. Audrey, bless her heart, is, she's a little bit dim. She's certainly not educated. She's very puzzled about what poetry is. And in fact, she says some very interesting and amusing things about poetry in discussion with her suitor, Touchstone. And Touchstone himself is a kind of a hybrid character. He's not interested in anything idealized. He's not interested in anything that's idealistic. He's interested in sex. He wants sensual, sexual gratification. He makes this perfectly plain in his exchange with Audrey. At one point, he contrives to get married to Audrey by a priest who really isn't a priest or isn't a licensed priest, so to speak. And he makes it plain. He wants to get married in this way so he can have sex with Audrey and not be held to the legal bond of matrimony. We have a spectrum, and on the one hand we have the idealized, romanticized characters, unrealistic characters, Phoebus and Sylvius, and on the other hand we have Touchstone and Audrey. We have everything from the very human, even the very animalistic, pressing the meaning of that word, to the rarefied and to the idealized. In the midst of this we have Rosalind and Orlando. Rosalind and Orlando, as you can see, just looking at the number of scenes that I have listed here, that couple is dominant. We see more of them than we see of the other couples. They impinge somewhat on each other, that is to say, they will appear in one another's stories or one another's really histories and one another's strands of action, but they're really kept apart and they are distinct. You will hear it in the way they speak, in the language that Shakespeare gives them, and we'll see it in the way they behave and so on. And what we see mainly are contrasts with Orlando and Rosalind. We have in Orlando and Rosalind the heroine, the comic hero, and the comic heroine. But what I want to point out here is the dominance and the predominance of Rosalind and Orlando. Rosalind has over 600 lines. That's 20% of all the lines in the play. Orlando has little more than 300 lines. So you can see how they dominate. You can see how they are predominant. And if you keep this scheme in mind, it will sort the whole out. Indeed, we have, as you can see, we have an organization. We have a structure. You can see that in Act 5, Scene 4, at the conclusion of the play, all three of these couples are on stage, and they all are on stage together. So this organization is not only systematic, and it's functional in the contrasts and comparisons between Sylvius and Phoebe and Touchstone and Audrey on the one hand, and Orlando and Rosalind on the other, but also you can see that the structure is not just a structure, it's not just an organization, but is, and this is a metaphor, makes for an architecture. Now, architecture is important. Architecture means the principal builder, principal fabricator. And it's not just artistic, it's not just appearance that we're concerned with a building. We're concerned that the building stands up. That's why the architect is the architect. So with a plot. it has to stand up. And that's what Shakespeare is always aware of. And if only we can say he's aware of this and he's concerned with this, the plot standing up, because he wants the audience to be kept with him. Because one thing we know for sure, among the other things that we know or think we know about Shakespeare, he was concerned with the box office. And if people can't follow the play, they're not going to come to the theater. And so whatever else Shakespeare is, a great philosopher, a great thinker, a theologian, a Roman Catholic, a Protestant, an atheist, a Jew, whatever else he is, he's concerned to keep his audience with him. He's a practical man of the theater, first and last. So, this is, in a very broad way, this is the structure, this is indeed the architecture of the plot of the play. I won't be coy. Aristotle says the plot is the soul of tragedy. Tragedy meant all literature, really, certainly all theater. The soul. It is the animating force of theater. He even goes so far as to say you could have a tragedy without characters, but you couldn't have one without a plot. If you figure out exactly what that means, I hope you tell me, because I've been thinking about it for a long time. What it plainly means is Aristotle thought, the plot was important, indeed superb. Of course, we don't have just a plot in comedy or just a plot in As You Like It. We have as well characters, and it may be in our age being 200 years or so, not that anyone is 200 years old, but it may be that we're more interested in characterization and characters than we were before. That's a matter for the cultural historians to debate. One fact, of course, is that the science that has driven so much of us and our ways of life, our art, our lives, is the science of psychology, which is comparatively new. The word of psychology, as we use it today, wasn't even used until the end of the 17th century, far after Shakespeare died. And of course, it came ever to be more of a concern by the chief literary form of modernity, that is, the novel. But of course, the drama never flagged far behind. In any case, we have, of course, characters in As You Like It. As we turn to the characters, I want to make a couple of remarks about even a more general topic in connection with plot and with character. How, we may ask ourselves, does the plot of As You Like It figure in the traditional plot of comedy? Well, it's well to keep in mind the general shape of the comic plot. And we can take it as an example, not a play, but of a work of world literature that is among the greatest works. And that is Dante's great poem, The Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy. Now, Dante calls it a comedy. Divine came to be appended to that title 200 years or so after Dante, early 14th century. Commedia. The word comedy is a Greek word, comes from Greek word komos. It means revelry. It means celebration. It means song. It means song and dance. And let me anticipate, we have revelry, we have song, and we have dance in As You Like It, as well as in the other Shakespeare romantic comedies. So the Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is a multiple of plots. Indeed, it's three parts, as we know, three canticles. The first part is the Inferno. It begins in disarray. It begins halfway through the journey of my life as the narrator, hero, principal figure, pilgrim, Dante says, halfway through the journey of my life, I found myself in a dark wood in Silva Oscura. He's separated. He's at a crisis. And he is taken on a journey. And the journey begins in the dark wood. The journey begins in conflict. Dante the pilgrim in conflict with himself. Dante the pilgrim in crisis. And he is led by Virgil through the Inferno, through hell, and onwards, then through purgatory, the Purgatorio, and ultimately to the Paradiso, to paradise, to heaven. There he is from the alienation of his experience, his life, his midlife crisis at the beginning of the Inferno. He is united with Beatrice, his earthly beloved who is now in heaven, Beatrice, the Blessed One. United with her, he is further educated, and this is what we have very much in comedy, is education. Characters are drawn, that's what education means, drawn out of themselves, led out of themselves. He is united with her, he is guided by her to the ultimate, that is to say, to God and salvation, and is united with God. And so it's cause for celebration indeed. Now if you look, you'll see the plot diagrammed in a different way, diagrammed horizontally, as it were, rather than vertically. Now I do this to suggest what, of course, we have in drama, and that is a process that's dynamic. It's not static, it's dynamic, it moves. And it moves, actually, this is what's unique about theater. It's actual, it moves. It moves. It's not like lyric poetry, it's not like a narrative, it's not like a novel. And I please myself to divide these things up, to analyze these things, and I please myself to use another word, to borrow another word, borrow it from music. And as you can see, I have divided, as you like it, up into three movements. And I think I'm being fairly responsible in doing this, fairly attentive to the facts of the text. And what, as you can see, we have the first movement, as I have put it, is the first act, the first three scenes, as it turns out. And these first three scenes, as you know, and as you will see in the production, begin as if it's a tragedy. It even begins perhaps even something like a Greek tragedy, because we have family internecine struggles. We have brothers against brothers, not one but two sets of brothers who are against each other. We have political strife. We have an actual physical altercation where Orlando, the hero of the play, gets into it physically with his brother Oliver, who indeed is almost choked to death by Orlando. So it begins ferociously, not just disarray, but conflict and physical conflict, so that at the end of this first act, we not only have Orlando driven out, not only disinherited, but driven out of the community in which he is, in which he finds himself, but we also have, analogously, we have Rosalind suffer comparable consequences from another tyrant, Duke Frederick, in the rest of the act. And what we watch are characters that are driven out of their community, driven out of their homes, who are alienated, who are turned into the other. It's not too much to say that the conclusion of the first act, or the first movement, as I please myself to put it, is in some ways tragic. That is to say, it points to tragedy. So what do we then have? Well, as I've divided it up, as I think in some ways Shakespeare divided it up, we have 3 acts. We have 3 acts. And those 3 acts, what do we have? We have development. We have education. And we'll look at some of the details of this. This is the heart, so to speak, of the play. And they escape, and they escape Rosalind with her dear sister, her cousin actually. They become, or it's pointed towards, that they become sisters-in-law at the end of the play. We will come to that. But they are together, and it is a relationship that is intimate and is functional in a variety of ways. And they escape, and as they say, they escape to liberty in the forest of Arden. So is the case with Orlando, with his trusted, venerable employee of their family, suggestively enough named Adam. And in that experience for 3 acts, they learn a great deal. They learn a great deal about themselves. Orlando learns a great deal about the world. He could use as much education as he gets, but he has a wonderful teacher, and that is, of course, Rosalind. And at the end of this second movement, actually spilling over to the last act, we have a final step taken. We have a final movement unfold. And that movement is orchestrated, if you allow me to continue with my musical metaphors, is orchestrated by Rosalind. And that orchestration leads to harmony. We have not only the lovers united, the 3 couples, but because of some loose ends, we have a 4th couple who are also united. We have brother and brother and another pair of brothers reconciled and united. We have, to repeat myself, harmonization. We have the conclusion of comedy. And importantly, we have a dance. And I'll come to that right before we finish. So how does all this happen? All this happens because of a single character. And that single character is Rosalind. Now, before I continue, I have a confession to make. This is an act of truth in lending. I fell in love with the character Rosalind in 1961, the fall of 1961. I was taking my first semester of Shakespeare at university. I suppose, I like to think I had heard of As You Like It, but I certainly hadn't read it, and I very certainly had not seen it produced. Well, it was a transforming experience. I read the play, I listened to the lecture, I even read the play again before the final examination, and I was falling ever more deeply in love. Well, life goes on. I never forgot. As You Like It, I never forgot Rosalind. Soon thereafter, I saw the first production, the Goodman Theater in Chicago. I fell more deeply in love. It continued. I went to graduate school. The fire burned ever more warmly and brighter in my heart. 62 years later, I'm still in love with Rosalind. Every time I think about her, every time I read the play, And certainly every time I see the play, I think how right my heart is. Now for me, a relationship that goes for 60 years is really special. So I want to make that plain as I turn to Rosalind. What does she have? She's in the midst of a bunch of characters who are, and this is completely in the comic mode, who are more or less stock characters. I pointed to this when we talked about Sylvius and Phoebe. It's even true of Touchstone. He's a low comic character. He's very clever, however, very facile. He's a professional fool. He's a professional clown. And he is a stock character, therefore. He's also an analog, in a way, to another character named Jakes or Jakes that we see in As You Like It. We have Orlando. He really is a stock character, too. He's, of course, good-looking. He's, of course, handsome. He's a very good wrestler as well. But he is kind of slow when you put him up against Rosalind. But the bar is very high with Rosalind. This, too, is actually a standard convention of comedy. It's comedy, as people have said, and I believe very firmly, comedy is a woman's world. The virtues that allow a comic heroine to be a comic heroine are those virtues that we ascribe to the female sensibility. Awareness, self-awareness, sympathy, intelligence that depends on imaginative powers and, to repeat myself, on sympathy. That's what allows them to prevail. And in Rosalind's case, that is what allows her to not only prevail, but to acquire a great deal of power and to control not just Orlando, but her entire environment. And so we ask ourselves, well, how can all this be? Well, I have a very homely answer for that. We're talking about the play. This can be, she can come to life as she does come to life. She can come to life by virtue of a standard comic convention. And that is a convention of the disguise. Now, a convention is a device that is unrealistic. And it is a device that allows the author, in this case the dramatist, to achieve his illusion, to achieve his imitation, to achieve his creation of an image, a whole play, but in this case, a character. Now, how can this be? Well, let's start with the unrealistic aspect of it. What a disguise involves is a character in romantic comedy, just about always a female character, dressing up like a man or dressing up like a different, another female character. That's what we have in As You Like It. That's what we have in As You Like It. It's completely unrealistic. It's completely unbelievable. Here's a character, a female character who's in love with a guy who happens to be in love with her. They leave their communities, as we say, and go into the forest of Arden. She dresses up like a young boy. She encounters him. He's so besotted that he writes poetry, and he takes the poetry and nails them to the trees in the forest. And everyone in the forest, of course, is reading these poems, which are dreadful. And they encounter each other. And they don't recognize that she is not recognized by him, the man who loves her. And as it turns out, she loves him. And they go on and they have interaction. They have a relationship. We'll get to the relationship in a moment. Now this is completely unrealistic. What this allows, of course, is an enormous latitude and liberty to Rosalind. She can do things that she would never say, she would never do to the man she's just met and she's fallen in love with in propria persona, in her own self. I used to ask my students, how long does it take before you start dating someone? How many texts do you send to each other before you start to, well, I wouldn't finish the sentence, be intimate, whatever? It would be a while. Not only even today, when we can text each other and send emails, but in the 17th century and before. But with a disguise, he doesn't know what she is thinking. He doesn't even know she's there, let alone as the person to whom she's speaking. That's liberating. What we have is a standard device, not just in comedy, but conspicuously in comedy, what we have in the theater, a situation we describe as dramatic irony. That is to say, we have characters on the stage and there's a discrepancy of awareness. Some characters know more than other characters, and we in the audience, we know most of all. We know most of all. So this is not only functional in enabling Shakespeare to develop the character of Rosalind, because we see what's going on in her head. We see what's going on in her heart. And let us not forget, and I urge you to be attentive to this, we have Celia with her all the time and on stage with her most of the time. And we see them talking to each other intimately without any, of course, mediation, without any rhetorical posturing, because they can say anything to each other. They can do anything in front of each other. And we know it all. So besides learning what's going on inside Rosalind's head, what's going on inside her heart, we are, which is very realistic, we are, in the audience, we are drawn into, we are interested in, we are engaged by, we are learning about the workings of her mind and heart, as well as the fumblings of poor Orlando. He's going to come along. He's going to come along. And so will Celia. This business of the disguise. One of the things I said earlier is that Shakespeare is practical. And he uses disguise in several of the romantic comedies. He does it variously. He does this very, very well here in As You Like It. It was the next to the last romantic comedy that he writes, 1599, 1600. Right? It was a very active period in Shakespeare's life. Right after As You Like It, he writes Twelfth Night and is writing Hamlet as well. And they come to the end of Act 1, and they're both Celia and Rosalind are in crisis. Certainly Rosalind isn't. What will I do? Says Rosalind. She seems to be utterly disenfranchised, utterly orphaned, if you will. And Celia says, "Let's escape all this." Well, how can we escape? What can we do? And Celia says, let's go into the forest of Arden. I'll take my credit card, my jewels, and so on, and we'll be all right. And Rosalind says, but you know, two girls going off into the forest of Arden, that's going to be dangerous. That's going to be dangerous. And the conversation goes on, and Celia says, I've got an idea. Let's dress up in disguise. I will put on makeup to make us look dark complected. We won't look like fair young ladies. White was desirable, not a deep tan in the late 16th century. And right away we get a good insight into Rosalind. She's really been depressed, and the idea of dressing up in a disguise really appeals to her. And she says, were it not better, because that I am more than common tall, that I did suit me all points like a man? So we know something. She's taller. She's not only beautiful, she's tall and beautiful. And as she'll see, she's brilliant. And she says, I will dress up like a man, and I will act like a man. That is to say, even though I have a woman's heart, even though I am not physically brave, I'll be like a man who, most of them are not physically brave, but they behave as if they are. In other words, she gets into the role. Now, whatever else is required of an actor is they have to be able to get into the role. And whatever else that requires, it requires imagination to know how the character is, what the character must be and appear to come to life. That is what Rosalind has, and we see that right from the outset. And it's a wonderful exchange. It's just brief, but that's what Shakespeare can do. With brevity, he can be eloquent. And that's what we hear, and that's what we see. And this first movement concludes with Celia saying, now we go in content to liberty and not to banishment. So they're going off into the forest, and whatever else the forest is, it's a place of liberty. It's not a place, and you'll want to attend to this, it's not a place that is perfect. It's not a place that is absolutely prelapsarian. It's not literally paradise, but it is free, and it allows freedom. What is it free of? It is free of the community from which they leave, and the court from which they leave, which is civilized. It is governmental. There are laws. There are officers. And what do we see with the laws and the officers? We see the abuse of laws. We see the mishandling of affairs by the officers, by the dukes, and so on. Even brothers fighting with each other. From that, it is free. And what are they free to do? Well, what is really fetching about the Forest of Arden is that they are free to fall in love. And if you want an education, if you want to learn something, fall in love. The price may exceed, actually, the price of university tuition. But we'll see what happens. Now, what does happen is, in the midst of this, as I have suggested, and as many of you I'm sure know, Orlando just happens to end up in the Forest of Arden as well. And he is given to writing poetry because he is, whatever else, deeply in love with Rosalind as she is with him. This is another convention. We're rather more familiar with that. Love at first sight. Shakespeare will deal with this, of course, has already used this in Romeo and Juliet. It's completely unrealistic, of course, but these unrealistic conventions allow Shakespeare not only to be effective as a dramatist, but to be very realistic. And this is what we see here. So they're in the Forest of Arden, and she is in the Forest of Arden as well. And what she sees is poems written and tacked to the trees. And her name figures in these poems. And she naturally thinks to herself, could this be? And then she encounters Celia. And it's a wonderful exchange that they have where Celia sort of teases her about all this. And as they're talking, who just happens to walk in? Orlando. Now, the first thing that Rosalind thinks when she hears and finds out that he's in the forest and is writing poetry about it, she says, what am I going to wear? Here I'm dressed up with boys' clothes on, with a doublet, with a jacket, and a sword and all the rest. The self-awareness, you see, the femininity. But she can deal with it. She sees Orlando and she says to Celia, I will speak to him like a sassy lackey. And under that habit, she's playing another part. What we are about to see is a play within a play. And I will play the knave with him. And so she walks up to him. And she says, what are you doing here? What time is it? And there's a bit of an exchange. And she said, one thing I can tell about what's going on here is that there's no one in this forest who's in love. No. Says, no. I'm in love. She said, no, you're not in love. I said, how do you know? She said, I know what men look like who are in love, and you don't have any of the attributes, any of the characteristics of a man in love. And he said, well, I would like to prove it to you. She said, no. I know a lot about this. I had an uncle who was this is not Shakespeare's word. I had an uncle who was a therapist, and he used to treat people who were suffering from this disease, love. He used to treat them, and he used to cure them. And Orlando says, well, I don't want to be cured. She said, oh, it's not a problem because you're not in love. He said, I will prove it to you. She said, I will cure you. Well, how do you get cured from love? There used to be a song from the 60s. There ain't no cure for love. She says, what you do, here's how my uncle worked. You pretend that you are a suitor, that you are in love, and assume that I am your Rosalind. And you come to me and you woo me. And I guarantee, after a few interviews, you will be cured of love. As she says, your liver will be as clean and sound as a sheep's heart. He said, okay, you should know. Call me Rosalind. Well, where do you live? Come on, I'll show you where I live, and we can start the therapy. Again, that's my word. So you see what Rosalind is doing. She's taking control of the situation, and she's engaging in one of the supreme acts that humans can engage in. And what's one of those supreme acts that humans can engage in? Making a play. And why is it a supreme act? Well, it requires a great deal of skill, a great deal of knowledge, a great deal of sympathy, a great deal of imagination, and it's supremely important. Play is supremely important. Theater is supremely important. And we in the audience want to know how this is going to unfold, how this is going to play out. So, what do we have? What we have are 2 points in the play, and one of them we've already looked at, and this was this first interview where Rosalind sets up the game, sets up the play. Then we have further on, this in the text, it's in Act 4, we have a rather long passage, a rather long section, which in dramatization probably takes as much as 15, 20 minutes, in which they come together and which she interviews him and they respond to each other. And this is all part of the therapy that she's conducting. And I will anticipate what happens of course, is she badgers him in various ways. And it might be said from the outset, in fact, Celia raises this question. She says, why are you treating this guy this way? For example, he says, okay, we'll meet in 2 hours. Well, he's an hour late. He's going to pay for that, you see. And she just goes after him for being an hour late. It shows how little you care for me. It shows how little you really are in love, and so on. And it goes from there. She varies her tact. She changes her directions. She's running him all around the place, figuratively speaking. What she's doing, of course, in the first place, what she's doing is testing him. What does she want to know? What do you want to know when you first fall in love? You want to know really how much is the other person capable of reciprocating. Well, why do you need to know that? You need to know that because your life is on the line. Your heart is on the line. You can't do anything more risky. And she's, after all, just met him. And she hasn't really even exactly formally met him. So she wants to know as much as she can. Why does she want to know as much as she can? Self-preservation. She wants to know as much as she can because she doesn't want to lose absolute control. But of course, at the same time as she's putting him through all this, what she's doing is falling more and more in love with him. I have one word for this: realistic. Realistic. In the psychological sense, realistic. Even in the literary sense, we talk about realistic fiction. Realistic fiction is fiction of Henry James and so on. It deals with what goes on in the mind, what goes on in the heart. So one of the great, do I want to say miraculous, aspects of the paradox of an unrealistic device, the device of disguise, is what enables, what permits Shakespeare to be so realistic. And this, I would submit, As You Like It, is one of the most realistic plays that he ever wrote. And we watch it. And we in the audience are fascinated. This is drama. We may say that, well, very little happens in As You Like It. We have these couples who keep talking to each other and occasionally talking to one another, but nothing happens. Everything happens. What could more happen in our experience as human beings than what is happening here, right in front of our eyes? For example, here's where they're talking to each other. And Rosalind says at one point, "Come, woo me, for now I am in a holiday humor, and like enough to consent." And all of this talk is, it points to a physical, it points to an actual human sexual relationship. Holiday, I'm ready to party. And I'm like enough to consent. And what would you do? She says. He said, well, what would I say? She said, oh, don't talk. Why don't you kiss me? What if she'd refuse? She said, I would refuse. He said, you refuse? She says, I will not have you. And that means have you as a boyfriend, have you as a lover, have sex with you. And Orlando says, then I die. I die. And Rosalind says as follows, no, Faith, die by attorney. The poor world is almost 6,000 years old, and all this time there is not any man that died in his own person in a love cause. And then she goes on and gives two examples from literature of heroes, Troilus and then Leander, who have died. And she said, they all died. They were in love. They died. But these are all lies, she continues. These are all lies. Men have died from time to time, and worms have eaten them, but not for love. Now, the language here is very plain. Men have died from time to time, and worms have eaten them. Not only plain, really rather actualistic, colloquial, even vernacular, even vulgar. Worms have eaten them. I hear, when she says this, in the first place, I hear fact, statement of fact. Besides taxes, the only sure thing is death. If you're healthy emotionally, psychologically, when you're in love, you're not thinking about death. Rosalind is realistic. Men have died from time to time and worms have eaten them, but not for love. What's pointed to when Orlando says, I would die if she wouldn't have me, is the great ideal, the romantic ideal of, well, I cannot live without her, or I cannot live without him. Why? Because she is so much of me. It's not that she means so much of me, she is so much of me that without her I am not. I am not. And so I will die. As I mentioned earlier, we have this ideal certainly in Romeo and Juliet and as Antony and Cleopatra. It's an ideal. It's an ideal. It's unrealistic. But when she says, men have died from time to time and worms have eaten them, pause, but not for love. What I hear is a kind of melancholy, yearning, even sadness. She knows the ideal. She knows what it is. But if only it were true. So what we watch here in just a few strokes, and what we hear here in just a few notes, is consummate realism. And at the same time, she's not cynical. She's not skeptical. She's in love. And she's in love, and that leads her, of course, to the awareness that deepens her awareness of the ideal of love. It's all here in Rosalind. It's all here in Rosalind. Right away she changes, says, let's do this. And she says to Celia, you play the priest and marry us. Celia says, I cannot say the words. Now, once again, remember what Celia is doing. Celia is right there, and she's the audience that we watch. So this is really complex, isn't it? This is a play we're watching. We're watching a play to begin with, her going into disguise and going to the Forest of Arden, and then we watch this other play that she's just contrived. You pretend that I am your Rosalind, and you woo me, even though I'm not really your Rosalind, which of course she is. And then we're going to have further a play, a mock wedding. And Rosalind says, you must begin. Will you, Orlando? Celia says, well, all right. And she tries to, what does she do? Stop laughing or put her hands over her face? Will you, Orlando, have to wife this? These, of course, this is literal quotation of the Book of Common Prayer and the marriage ceremony. Orlando, have to wife this Rosalind? He says, I will. She's really pushing the envelope here, isn't she? what does Rosalind do on stage when she says, I will? Rosalind. Aye, but when? Why now, as fast as she can marry us. Orlando is dominated by what? We've all read novels where men behave this way. He's motivated by testosterone. Let's get on with it. Then you must say, this is Rosalind, then you must say, I take thee, Rosalind, for wife. I take thee, Rosalind, for wife. And then she stops the ceremony. The audience follows this. Why does the audience follow this? Is the audience delighted by this? If they're delighted, or if those in the audience are delighted by this, they're rejoicing in the spectacle that Rosalind is creating here. She's creating this. Is she, Rosalind, whom we all, of course, are attracted to, some of us are in love with, rejoice in how good she is at this? This is like watching Isaac Perelman play the violin. And poor Orlando. Well, that's the way that it goes. That's the way that it goes. She's running, and I use this word advisedly, she's running the show. And all the while, she's falling ever more in love. She's not a cold, calculating creature. Oh, she is, but she's so much more. She's so much more. And she says, now, you show up again, and you show up on time. And he walks off stage. And there's this wonderful exchange between her and Celia then. And it's so wonderful because, of course, between them there is no acting. It's on, as I put it, it's unmediated. And Celia says to her, you have behaved disgracefully. You have disgraced our sex. And she says, cuz, dear little cuz, I am so much in love. I am so much in love. Why is she so much in love? As we've said, she's discovering more and more about Orlando, which compels her. His innocence, his goodness, whatever, she's in love. Ever more so. Maybe even you could say, well, she knows she can always get around him. I don't know. She's in love. She's in love. And so we move on. We move to the conclusion. We move to the conclusion. And as we move to the conclusion, the play isn't over. You needed me to tell you that. We have an act to go and the play is not over. What I mean by that, of course, is that there's another play. And Rosalind says at one point, this is in Act 5, she says at one point, I will change all this. Orlando says, this is fine, but I wish I had the real Rosalind. Because these other characters, these other couples are kind of coming together and so on. And Rosalind says, I understand. And I will bring Rosalind before you. And what goes on, and you will see this in the production, what goes on is that she arranges, this is a little bit into Act 5, Scene 2. She arranges all of the couples to agree to marry. It's an act of betrothal, if you will. They're going to get engaged. Okay? And she says, now, you've all agreed to this. And they all say yes. She says, okay, I will come back. She goes off stage. There's some other stuff that goes on. She comes back on stage. And she comes back on stage with a god, the god of marriage, Hymen. And what ensues, this is Act 5, Scene 4, what ensues is the betrothal / marriage of not 3 but 4 couples, because it includes Celia and Oliver, who turned out to be a good guy who was such a bad guy in Act 1, Scene 1. But this happens in comedy all the time. What we have in comedy is transformation. And what we're watching now is the ultimate transformation. People coming together. Brother and brother, brother and brother, man and woman, man and woman, man and woman, man and woman. And the only ones who are excluded, one of the dukes, who's going to go off and live in a monastery or something, and Jacques, who doesn't want to take part of the whole thing. And they all resolve to come together and to return, leave the Forest of Arden and return to the community, return to the court. And we have a society that has been reconciled. It has a society in which there has been healing. There's a society, political, social, intellectual, that has been transformed. And emblematic of that transformation is a dance. And a dance is an emblem of harmony. We have music, we have people coming together in a formal way, touching each other, engaging in each other, forming a pattern. It is resolution, it's transformation. I won't say it very loudly, but it may even be salvation. I'm thinking of Dante again. And so the play concludes, the play ends. But not quite. The play must be perfected. And in comedy, we have an epilogue. An epilogue is a device, a convention, where it's very dangerous because we have the illusion completed, the world completed of comedy, of what we see on the stage, and we have a character from that world come out on stage and address the audience. And what the character does, at least the way Shakespeare usually does it, is address the audience in a very graceful, gracious way, urbane and witty, and at the end asks for applause. In Roman comedy, it's called the plaudete, which gives us our word, applause. And so the audience applauds. It may merge actually into the dance, where the audience may applaud at the dance. However it's done, what we watch is perfection. That is to say, there is a real completion of the whole spectacle, where we in the audience become integrated with the play. So just as the characters enter the Forest of Arden and come out entertained, delighted, in love, and educated, so we, in the audience, having gone into the Forest of Arden, so to speak, that is to say, having gone into the Rogue Theater and witnessing, being an audience of what goes on in the stage, we leave as well. And we go out on University Boulevard, having been interested, having been amused, having been delighted, maybe even falling in love, and having been educated. So we have a great show in front of us. And as they say in showbiz, enjoy the show. Thank you very much.